Catherine Ham, Brian Wilson, Brian Neiman, today's newsmakers, and you. The Morning Majority, 630.
WMAL.
It's 7:07 on The Morning Majority. Brian Wilson, Mary Catherine Ham here. Brian Neiman out this week. And while the debt ceiling debate has been going on, I lost track of a couple threads. Yeah. Foreign policy sort of went over my head. And so I've got the perfect guy here to help us catch up. Eli Lake, national security correspondent with the Washington Times. How you doing, Eli?
Great. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
No problem. I saw this story you wrote last week about Russia having something to do with a U.S. embassy bombing in the country of Georgia. Where did this come from? And isn't that a pretty big deal?
Well, let me say, on September 22nd, there were two bombs that were placed at near the external wall of the U.S. Embassy in Tbilisi, Georgia.
Right.
One of them went off. The other one was unexploded. It was over that wall in sort of the parking lot area. And this was an incident that, of course, something like that is going to require lots of investigations, starting with diplomatic security and also probably intelligence. And, of course, the Georgians were involved, too. And, Georgia's a long way away. There was a war in 2008 between Russia and Georgia. And the Georgian government arrested a guy who said, I was told to do this by a Russian military intelligence major by the name of Yevgeny Borisov.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody really picked up the story in Washington, although the Georgian local press wrote about it at the time. And it was dismissed by the kind of cognoscenti of Russia experts as, there's a war between, there's a conflict between Georgia and Russia. The Georgians say nasty things about the Russians say nasty things about the Georgians, and, kind of people moved on. So I have written about 3 stories, and I've got another one coming out tomorrow on the incident. And what I've determined is that actually U.S. intelligence looked into this as well, namely the CIA, and they agree that the guy who was behind this bombing is a Russian military intelligence major named Yevgeny Borisov.
Wow.
And that information has, prompted, I'm somewhat honored, but the deputy foreign minister of Russia personally denounced little old me last week. So, I've been having a pretty good run.
That is pretty good. And what does that mean for the reset with Russia, Eli?
Well, it means that the reset applied to things like, the UN Security Council, but while the reset was going on, it clearly, I think what you'll find is that the people who were pro-reset in the Obama administration, like the White House, they will say that, this was a rogue action, but not reflecting, a stated policy of the Kremlin. And I don't think anybody says that the Kremlin, deliberately planned to bomb the U.S. Embassy in September.
Right.
But this rogue agent is still in the breakaway province of Abkhazia. And usually when, the U.S. would tell the Russians, hey, you've got an agent who we think we know is behind the bombing of our embassy, that person would be recalled to Moscow.
Right.
The fact that he wasn't recalled suggests maybe it wasn't planned in Moscow, but certainly it's not a high enough priority that they've managed to recall this guy.
I'm very worried about our relationship right now with the Russians. Vladimir Putin is on the ascendancy over there. He recently was quoted as saying that the United States is a parasite on the world. And these are the people with whom we partnership now to go to the International Space Station. The only way we have to get into outer space right now is through our friends, the Russians. It would seem that our relationship with them is not on the firmest of grounds at the moment.
Oh, it's not just the space station. These are the people that the State Department is currently trying to come up with a cooperative missile defense agreement with. This is the same Russians who the U.S. has promised openly to help with their membership into the World Trade Organization. There has been very little public, high-level criticism in Russia of their continued occupation of 2 provinces of Georgia based on the 2008 war. And while recently there has been more done to signal discomfort and criticism of Russia's, absolute, sort of appalling human rights record internally, that was muted for the first year and a half or 2 years of the Obama administration as well. The reset has had an effect on the fact that the Russians have allowed the U.S. to resupply through Kyrgyzstan, and they threatened to use their political pressure to stop that. So the Russians have been helpful in some ways on Afghanistan. They have been helpful in Iran, in that they are not selling a complicated missile defense system known as the S-300 to the Iranians, and they supported the the latest round of the UN Security Council sanctions against Iran. And so those are tangible achievements, I suppose, in terms of improved relationship with Russia. However, there are all these other things, including the bombing attempt in September 22nd of the U.S. Embassy in Tbilisi, which really hasn't changed.
Right. Well, let's move to the Middle East real quick. Iraq's political leaders this week gave the U.S. or gave the government in Iraq the green light to negotiate with the U.S. to keep Americans in the country. Correct? I know you've been to Iraq several times. How important is that?
Well, that is extremely important. It is the beginning of the negotiation. It's a formal signal that a U.S. training mission can stay in the country. Though, I have to say, in addition, I mean, it's a license to say, let's negotiate an extension to the status of forces agreement that said all the troops have to be out by the end of 2011. Anyone who's followed this, and I've written this, I wrote this 2 years ago, has predicted this day was going to eventually come. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons we know it's going to come is because there's no such thing as an Iraqi Air Force.
Right.
The Iraqi Air Force is the U.S. Air Force. So if the Iraqis want anyone to patrol their skies, and they have reason to want someone to do that because they have there are other countries that do have air forces, like Iran, that just present problems for them, the U.S. would have to stay. The other reason is because the Iraqis have purchased an enormous amount of complicated equipment from the United States that will be delivered in years, for the next 10 years. And usually when equipment, and we're not talking about, machine guns, we're talking about complicated, anti-aircraft systems, complicated, fighter systems and so forth. It requires a lot of training. And that training, unless they want to send their soldiers to the United States and have it be much more expensive, would probably have to happen within Iraq. And finally, I would say that the Iraqi military still has a huge problem with basic logistics, which is just getting from A to B in their country and keeping what's known as the supply chain intact. They would require the U.S. as well. Now, it's possible that they could have said formally, the U.S. military is now out of Iraq, we're finally free of the occupation, yada, yada, yada.
Right. And
then would rely, all of those things I just said would be done by military contractors, but, it would pretty much be the same thing. So I think that, this is in many ways a recognition that the Iraqi military in Iraq needs the U.S. military, and there'll be a relationship there for some time.
All right, Eli. Well, thank you so much. We got to let you go for today, but we appreciate your insight on all those